I want to welcome everybody to this evening's webcast, Beyond Reform, Reenvisioning the Role of Police. My name is John Hallway. I'm an Associate Dean at Penn Law and Executive Director of Penn Law's Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice. On behalf of my colleagues at the Toll Public Interest Center and Penn Law's Office of Inclusivity and Engagement, it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce this webcast, the first of an ongoing series of conversations about racial justice and police reform, and part of a larger set of initiatives to support not just the Penn Law community, but our communities across the country in these challenging times. Penn Law has committed to support all communities in their anti-racism advocacy and to convene action-oriented conversations to advance the reimagining of a justice system into one that is truly just. We have much to learn and even more to do. To start that process, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dorothy Roberts, who is the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology and the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander Professor of Civil Rights at Penn. She's also the founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society in the Center for Africana Studies. I'm going to let Professor Roberts introduce the rest of our star-studded panel, but want to let the audience know that we will have time at the end for questions. Audience members are encouraged to submit questions in writing at any time during the webcast. We currently have well over 300 people here, which is fabulous. And so there's no way we'll be able to get to everybody's questions given the large number of people in the audience, but we will do our best. Finally, this webcast is being recorded and we'll send out a subsequent communication when it's posted online. Professor Roberts, thank you so much for being here and leading this fascinating, timely, and important conversation. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks to the Quattrone Center for hosting this webinar. I'm really honored to be able to kick off the Quattrone Center's summer series focused on policing in America, which, as you said, is part of Penn Law's broader year-long colloquium series on achieving racial justice. The massive uprisings that have occurred for several weeks now in Philadelphia, across the nation and around the world are an unprecedented demand to end police violence in America. More people than ever are calling for change that moves beyond failed reforms, and abolition is gaining momentum as a political vision and organizing strategy. People are recognizing that police killings of Black women, men, and children are so pervasive they can no longer be considered aberrations. The problem isn't a few bad apples or rogue practices, but the very function of police in our society. So we need structural, not individual approaches, transformation, not fixes. The most prominent demand emerging from the protests is to defund the police and reallocate the money to provide healthcare, education, jobs with living wages and affordable housing. But even as these calls for transformation, defunding, and even abolition make more sense to many people, there's just as much confusion over what they mean and what concrete actions they require. So I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity to engage in conversation this evening with three of the leading scholar activists who've been thinking imaginatively beyond reform in policing and can help us think through these critical questions. Let me introduce our panelists briefly, and you can learn more about them and their work on the webpage for this webinar. Amna Akbar is an associate professor of law at the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. I'm not going to tell you everybody's scholarship on this. Each of our panelists has really amazing articles on this topic, and I'll just name one for each panelist. So for Professor Akbar, you would be very interested in her fantastic article, Toward a Radical Imagination of Law, published in 2018 in the NYU Law Review. Next, we have Monica Bell, who's an associate professor of law and an associate professor of sociology at Yale. And one of her influential articles is Police Reform and the Dismantling of Legal Estrangement, which was published in 2017 in the Yale Law Journal. And our third panelist is Jocelyn Simonson, who's a professor of law at Brooklyn Law School. And she is the author of the forthcoming article in the Yale Law Journal, Police Reform Through a Power Lens. So you can see our panelists are truly leading experts who thought long and hard and creatively on these questions. I'll be moderating our conversation by asking the panelists questions and encouraging us to engage with each other for about an hour. And then I'll open up the program for questions from the audience. As John just mentioned, you should ask your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom. And John will curate them and forward them to me to ask our panelists for discussion. So with that, let me just jump in with our wonderful experts. And I thought it would be great to start out as a way of introducing both the topic and your scholarship to tell us how it fits into the calls to move beyond reform in policing. What does that mean to you? And how is it reflected in your research and other work? So maybe Professor Akbar, do you want to begin answering that question?
Sure, thanks, Dorothy. Thanks, Professor Roberts. It's such a pleasure and—
Call me Dorothy. We'll go by first names
okay.
From now on. Okay.
Privileged to be with all three of you tonight. So I thought I would respond to this question by telling a little bit of a story of my scholarly journey. When I started lawyering and then writing as a law professor, I started by writing about the policing of Muslims after 9/11 and how after 9/11, policing in prisons, the larger kind of carceral apparatus kind of intensified itself and its focus on Muslim communities. And also how the national security framework worked to kind of bolster the power of the police, and it's focused on Black and brown communities more broadly, as well as poor people. And I spent a lot of time trying to document all of those ways that policing intensified and morphed in some ways after 9/11. And for those of you who read law review articles or produce law review articles, you know that there's kind of this formula where in the first two parts you kind of document a problem and identify an issue, and then that last part of the article is where you're supposed to come in and tell the world how to fix the problem that you've documented in the first part of the article. And in those early articles, when I was writing about policing of Muslims after 9/11, I could never write that last part of the article. And as a junior scholar, as a new scholar, I got a lot of pressure to write the part about the fix. How do you fix this problem? And I could never quite do it. The problem I was trying to name, which was about police as state violence and the way it was deployed or is deployed under different guises against different communities, and as part and parcel of a process of racialization. So racializing Black people as criminal, racializing Muslims as terrorists, seemed too deep and broad to fix. And so it seemed kind of like I could never write that last part. Not only was the policing itself focused on violence and criminalization and targeting people with relatively less social, economic, political power in our society, but it was also part of an ideological system that debased Muslims and Black and brown people as inherently violent in ways that disavowed white modes of violence and then kind of doubled onto itself to justify the whole system. And so I was never sure quite what to say. I wouldn't write that final part. I kind of deflected on the Q&A I would get after presenting papers. And then in 2014 and 2015, when Darren Wilson killed Michael Brown, the Baltimore police killed Freddie Gray, and we had these uprisings around the country, I was moved by the uprisings and by the organizing, and I started to pay much closer attention than I had in the past to protest and organizing. And as I started to pay attention to what people were saying at these protests and in these uprisings all around the country, it really shifted my understanding of racial justice, the centrality of anti-Black racism to the United States and the shape of the world, and the essential nature, the essential connection between what we see now and the history of both enslavement and colonialism to discourses and practices and realities of race in the United States. And so I realized as a non-Black person of color that I had a lot of study to do, and I began to kind of study more deeply the history of this country, the history of the Black freedom struggle and other past social movements. And I started to appreciate something that law and law schools tend to obscure, which is that our political, economic, social kind of setup is not stable. And it's not consistent, it doesn't stay the same over time. And in fact, it's the product of deep and constant contestation between different social forces, and the law kind of plays a role in that. And so I started to learn about that kind of dialectic. I started to learn about these traditions of resistance, solidarity, and transformation that weren't just about struggle, but they were also intellectual traditions that had worldviews and kind of conversations internal to them, and talking to the rest of the world as well. And so I started to write about what my study of those movements then and now was teaching me, and how that was shifting my conception of the problem of police and prisons and how we move forward. And I had, some years before that been introduced to the idea of abolition, but it was really in 2014 that I started to kind of deepen my study of prison abolition specifically, and started to realize that the problem with most legal scholarship and the way that a lot of lawyers tend to think about policing is partly about the horizon of how we think about reform or how to respond. It's fixated on repair and on the rule of law. And abolition, and I'll just say a little bit about this right now, but it offered a broader, deeper vision that kind of spoke to that part of me where early in my career I didn't know what to say about what we should do, that it centered rather than sidestepping the hard questions about the role of police in society. It provides kind of a framework for building now the world that we really want to live in tomorrow. So how do we start doing that work now instead of constantly pushing that question for later? And it really centers the kind of reckoning that if we care about racial, economic, and gender justice, there are aspects of our society that we need to tear down, and there are aspects that we need to build up. And it was really that deep and broad vision of abolition, its rootedness in struggles against colonialism, against anti-Black racism, that shifted the way that I think about police and police reform and the work of law in it all.
Wow, thank you. Thanks for that. Monica, do you want to tell us how your work fits into moving beyond reform, however you want to frame that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I also want to just echo the gratitude for being here and sharing this space with all of you, including the people we can't see. So I start, I approach these issues as like basically a sociologist who is concerned about law. And my work is primarily based on qualitative research, so interviews, ethnography, and I've done that in various cities around the US. And I guess there are a few different impulses behind that. So one is I think when you actually talk to people and kind of everyday people about like their experiences and what their hopes and dreams are for the law, you get a lot of different, really complex and sometimes conflicting responses. And so one of the hallmarks, I think, of my work, I guess there are a couple of things. One is the complexity, like the fundamental complexity of all of these issues in terms of what people are asking for. So this comes up a lot. We have this talk about the over policing, under policing paradox. So that's one thing that people talk about a lot. But one of the things I come from this vantage point from the research I've done is that people are really concerned about some of the issues we think police deal with, like safety and security, but we take people's concerns about safety and then therefore think, okay, well, let's ratchet up the one thing we have available to deal with that. And so but without hearing or focusing on the the concerns people have about, and specifically, I should say, my work focuses on Black people in our experiences. And so we don't hear all of that at the same time. And that's a very limiting kind of paradigm from which to think about transformation in a fundamental way. Another piece of the work kind of related to that is that I focus on real human stories. So one of the things that happens a lot in law and legal analysis is the move to flatten people's actual stories and experiences. I mean, we lose sight of humanity in the law. And so one of my core motivations in doing this work is forcing people who read law review articles and who think theoretically and conceptually about law to actually attach a human being to that thinking. And so I think that that's one piece. Another piece of my work that's been fundamental is exploring the intersection between policing and other institutions. Mm-hmm. So kind of the basic story of how I even started studying policing. I'm not like a policing scholar. Like I don't consider myself a policing scholar. I am really interested in racial justice and people's visions of that and their kind of experiences on that journey. And so I started doing this work by interviewing Black women, Black mothers in Washington, D.C. And I was asking about all kinds of aspects of their legal experiences, and what you get when you start from tell me about your life instead of tell me about police is the complexity of how these institutions intersect. So I can say a little bit more about this later. I plan to, but I'm just maybe kind of drilling down on a couple of theoretical concerns that come out of this that might be helpful in the conversation. So one, the article that you mentioned, Dorothy, about legal estrangement, there are kind of three big pieces of that that are sort of beyond the traditional reform, or that the impulse is beyond traditional reform. One is, so the idea of legal estrangement is an idea that instead of focusing on whether people trust whatever it is, the police, whatever, we should instead be thinking about how institutions fundamentally operate to exclude and to send messages of social exclusion. And so it twists the lens from the people and what's wrong with them and how to like repair that, and instead examines the messages of exclusion. And so I focus in that article on kind of three different levels through which that operates. So one is the interpersonal, and I think, so let's drill on this, the interpersonal between the police officer and the individual, the Black individual, often in a lot of what we're talking about here, how that person is addressed in their experience. And I'm not going to say that that is unimportant for us to think about, but that's not where change that is fundamental is going to happen. So part of the impulse behind the article is to move beyond that toward, I'll call it vicarious marginalization in the article. I think I would refer to it more specifically and explicitly as kind of the ideology or kind of the idea, the collective memory, understanding that as part of a group of Black people, there are collective experiences that are built up over generations that actually dictate what the nature of the relationship is. So confronting collective memory as a real part of whatever this breach is. And then finally, I talk about structural aspects. And so of legal estrangement. So this is where you kind of start thinking about the relationship between policing and other forms of inequality. So in my most recent article that just came out a couple of weeks ago, I focus on residential segregation, but that's just one example. And we don't look at how, at a deep level, at how policing relates to residential segregation, how it perpetuates it, and is also perpetuated by residential segregation, as just one of many examples. So I'm going to stop there, but that's a sampling.
Yeah, that was a lot to think about. Thanks for that. Jocelyn, would you like to jump in?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me here with all of you collectively. So my work focuses on how people intervene collectively in the criminal legal system in ways that disrupt the system and contest the dominant ideas that uphold the carceral state, the different components that make up the carceral state. So for example, I think about how groups engage in community bail funds, in participatory defense, and in court watching in the context of the criminal courthouse. And when they do that, they undermine the dominant ideology there that criminal prosecutions are the best way to protect communities from harm. And then I also look at similar communal forms of resistance with respect to policing. So for example, organized cop watching groups that go out and actively and collectively challenge power dynamics in the moment by filming police officers and intervening in what's happening there. And now more recently, I'm studying the ways that social movements are envisioning new governing arrangements with respect to the police that shift power arrangements, for example, through community control of the police and through social movement groups that get together over time to design things like people's budgets that propose divesting from the carceral state and defunding policing. And so one of the things that all of these kinds of interventions have in common is that these groups are engaging in acts of communal contestation that help shift larger ideas. And this gets to the intellectual discussions that Amna was referring to that are taking place in social movement spaces. So for example, when people sit inside of a courtroom as court watchers on behalf of somebody who's accused of a crime, they're challenging the idea that the prosecution is representing the people, as in all of us, when they do a criminal prosecution. Or when people post bail in a situation where the state has said that somebody needs to be incarcerated for public safety, a group says that they communally feel safer when that person is out. And they undercut that ideology of public safety that makes all of these things possible. And when they're doing that, they're not asking for better versions of what we have now, right? When they say we want to have community control of the police, it's not to make policing as we know it better. They're asking for a complete shift in our power arrangements when it comes to defining justice. And they're asking first order questions about how the state should provide safety and security in the first place. And that question, how should the state be providing safety and security, has been a question in movement spaces and in a lot of places for a long time. But now here we are, and it's one that's in front of the public for discussion for the first time in a long time, if ever in the history of this country. And so to the extent my work is relevant, it's because it's by listening to and thinking alongside those who have been working to resist the status quo that we have the best chance of taking these first order questions that we have. How should the state keep us safe? Should it be by using the mechanisms of the carceral state that we have, or are there other ways? And it's these groups that have been communally intervening that have started in real time to shift our understandings. And so it's those understandings that my hope is that we can study and take seriously and work alongside as we start to figure out where to go next.
Wow, those were all such rich and insightful answers about your work. I just want to highlight a couple things that are just moving me right now that all of you focused on. All of you spoke about how your scholarship, your research and your scholarship is so intimately entangled with the experiences of everyday people and movement organizing. Like none of you just writes about this abstractly, figures out the logical answer. In fact, Amna said, you don't get an answer if you just relied on legal doctrine or abstract reasoning. I think it's really so profound to say that the answer that you all have found is in listening to, in the case of Monica, everyday people, Black mothers, and Amna and Jocelyn both speaking about learning from organizing communities, from movements that provided an answer you could not find in just using the traditional legal tools. I think that's so powerful. And it says a lot about how the idea that abolition is some kind of strange, obscure idea, when in fact, it comes out of engaging in these questions with the people whose lives are at stake and thinking about how can we really make a change. It's realistic, from everything you all are saying, and I agree with you. It's realistic. It provides an answer that other tools haven't provided. The other thing that struck me was this is mostly from Monica, what you said is the way in which policing intersects with lots of other institutions, systems, and aspects of racism in America. I think both Amna and Jocelyn, you were also talking broadly about policing, and maybe this is something that we can talk about more in our discussion, but that this isn't just about police departments. It's about the way in which policing more broadly functions in our society. And I believe very strongly that it's critical to think about how that involves the relationships, the very deeply entwined relationships of lots of institutions. Monica, you mentioned talking to Black mothers and that helping you understand, policing in a broader way, and also your recent work on residential segregation. And my work recently has brought together work I've been doing for a long time on we could call it child welfare system, foster care system. Those are such misnomers. I would call it a family regulation or family destruction system. But I learned about that from talking with Black mothers. My original work was on Black women who were prosecuted for drug use during pregnancy, which involves massive policing. And that brought me into the foster care system because I found out how many of these mothers were having their children taken away from them. And I've recently written about the way in which prisons and foster care work together very broadly. I won't go into that now, but they're deeply, deeply entangled. And in fact, Monica, you're speaking about residential segregation brought to mind one of the few qualitative studies. I'm actually appointed in sociology here at Penn myself, and I did once do a small qualitative study in a neighborhood in Chicago about the experiences of everyone in that neighborhood with the child welfare system in one way or the other. And it relies very much on residential segregation, because most of these investigations, this form of policing, is in segregated, impoverished Black neighborhoods. So that's just one example of what you said. And I hope also as we continue, we can learn more, Jocelyn, about these forms of communal contestation that could be models for people who are looking to, what are the next steps? What do we do? What does this concretely mean? That we need to be looking at what communities are already doing. And that can provide us with inspiration and models, but we'll get to that later on. So let me move on to another question. And thank you again. I could go on and on, believe me, with just responding to all the wonderful insights that you brought up just in response to my first question. But I want to build on what you said with your insights about in what ways your approach to the question of moving beyond reform differs from dominant concepts of reform. And why is it, even though, as I just kind of summarized from everything you three said, an approach that moves beyond reform offers answers, but to many people, it seems completely inconceivable to talk about anything beyond the current system or just sort of tweaking it to make it, to improve it, let alone abolition. Seems so inconceivable to so many people, they don't even want to think about it. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what are the main differences and why do you think it's hard for people to wrap their heads around the concept of moving beyond reform, the concept of abolition, the concept of transformation? And maybe in answering that, we might also get to how we might persuade people that these are important approaches, at least to consider. And maybe we could, I mean, I'm happy just going around the same way, Amna, Monica, Jocelyn, but feel free, you know, if something strikes you to jump in, but we could just continue around that way. I don't know if you want to start, Amna.
Sure. So one of the things I've learned in part by working with organizers and social movements is to always kind of ask 3 questions. And so these are kind of the questions I'm also asking in my work all the time, which is 1, what is your account of the problem? 2 is what is the horizon for change, or what's the world that you're fighting for? And 3, what's your theory from how we get from where we are now to where you're trying to go, right? And maybe part of the reason I fixate on these questions is because the accounts of these, or the answers that you get for these 3 questions are deeply different, depending on, generally, if you speak to lawyers and legal academics and people in social movements and organizing spaces. And so, you know, my answer to all 3 of those questions, I would say, are probably pretty different than most legal scholars and a lot of lawyers, which is what then shapes my kind of particular sense about policing and abolition in a way that is distinct, I would say. So what is the account of the problem? Obviously, this is shifting right now, but you know, the prevailing liberal conception of the problem with police is that you have individual bad apples, you have insufficient training, you don't have enough cops of color, and you know, and that you know, people are not following the law, and so on and so forth. Whereas the account that you know, I haven't developed myself, but I've kind of, you know, I have kind of come to by studying and reading all sorts of stuff, is that, and living in the world, is that the problem is that we live in a highly stratified society where wealth is hoarded, land and nature are disrespected, the labor of people who are Black and brown especially is extracted in inequitable ways for terrible pay, and collectively we invest so little in collective care, and that police and prisons are the embodiment and practice of violence and the threat of violence to keep the system kind of in place. And in addition to kind of a conceptual framework in the way that Jocelyn was talking about around public safety. And so that's the kind of the general account, the quick account of the problem. And of course, then it's rooted in histories of enslavement and colonialism. What's the horizon? I mean, I think this is really interesting. I've taken a deep dive in the last few years for this article I've been working on, you know, in the kind of liberal police reform scholarship and law, what is the account for what we're fighting for? And I think it's absolutely and almost completely unclear what kind of the end game is. I mean, I think probably most law scholars you would ask who are writing kind of in that vein would say, we want police to be turned to violence less frequently. But beyond that, there's no kind of, it doesn't seem to me that there is a kind of a deeper or broader ambition. Whereas, you know, the horizon for change that I'm interested in kind of, and kind of motivates the way that I think about the question of reform is the abolitionist horizon, right? So what do people need to thrive? And Dorothy, as you were talking about at the kind of top of the hour, housing, healthcare, education, enough you know, money to pay for basic needs and time for pleasure and so on and so forth. And a world in which we don't resort to state-sanctioned violence to solve interpersonal and socioeconomic conflict, and that we have in general a lot less violence, right? Interpersonal violence will not ever go away. Conflict and harm are inherent in human interaction, but to kind of decrease it, right? And that's part of the abolitionist critique, is that police and prisons just increase exponentially the amount of violence in the world instead of decreasing it. And then finally, the theory of change, right? So for lawyers, a lot of times we talk and think about courts and maybe Congress. So kind of powerful elites and their ability to kind of change. And so we kind of target our arguments at those people at the top and the way that they conceive of these problems, try to shift them slightly, or what they might find appealing, or they might kind of accept. But when I look at history and when I'm living in this moment, part of what we're all kind of witnessing in profound and visceral ways is the way that social movements, organizing, organic grassroots uprisings can really, along with organizing, kind of shift the way that that we think about who we are, how we should relate to each other, what we're entitled to. And so my theory of change is very much focused on the power of everyday people, the history of collective resistance, and social movements. And so because of that, you know, I'm less interested, and sometimes I'm, you know, kind of like a terrible law scholar for this reason, of like coming up with like my own individual answer to anything. I don't have individual answers to anything. What I'm interested in is kind of collective processes of ideation, experimentation, in the context of groups of people who are trying to build a better, more just, more equitable world. And really briefly, like, so what part of what that means is, like, when we think about reform, we can't just focus on police. We have to kind of look at all of the systems of violence, exploitation, and control that you were all talking about. We can't be fixated on investments, which is kind of the traditional way of thinking about reform. So like we were talking about before, diversity trainings, better policies, and so on, body cameras. We have to focus on divestment, on alternate forms of responding to interpersonal harm, on collective provision and social care. And so one trick I often use when I'm feeling stuck in kind of like a criminalized kind of mode of thinking as opposed to an abolitionist one is I often think of the problem of homelessness or houselessness, right? And so we know that across the country, we turn to police and prisons as the primary mode for dealing with housing insecurity. We live in a country where there's profound housing insecurity, and we are seeing that skyrocketing right now. And kind of the prevailing kind of liberal police reform response to that would be maybe to train the police to treat homeless people with more respect, maybe to refer them to pre-existing homeless shelter, and maybe to repeal some of the laws that empower police to arrest and jail people who are housing insecure. But of course, that misses the larger structural questions about why it is that in the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world, so many people don't have adequate shelter or food. It ignores the question that we have, or ignores the reality that we have disproportionate sums of money invested in jails and prisons rather than housing. And it doesn't take on centrally the question of why police play such a central role in justifying and holding in place the social order that we have.
Thanks, Amna. I'm tempted to engage with that so much. But let's keep going, and then maybe we can have some engagement after everybody answers the question. So Monica, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of pick up there. I mean,
yeah.
To some degree. I mean, I think, I think. Well, I'll just say this, before I knew there was anything about like what the idea of abolition was, it was really clear that we had invested far too much in policing as the primary. I mean, so when I was interviewing these Black mothers, police were conduits to all sorts of goods, things like being able to relocate within your public housing. You need a police report to ease the pathway toward that. That seems really minuscule. It seems almost bureaucratic, but you have to call the police and engage them in some kind of issue with your neighbor, and like basically have them involved in ways that are challenging. So I think this is something that people who live under conditions of marginality already have a sense of. And so people, and Forrest Stewart has actually written about this, a great sociologist at Stanford, where kind of people become cop-wise, or kind of learn, learn how to navigate policing, and that sort of knowledge could be used elsewhere. And it's kind of like a big waste of our intellectual power to be focused in that way. There are a couple of other points I wanted to raise here. So in terms of like how how all these things relate to ideas of abolition. So one of the things I try to focus on in my work is that a lot of the violence people are concerned with, the violence that people are concerned with, especially on a day-to-day basis, are not the things we see in the news. There's this routine violence of policing that is not always physical, but sometimes is often about threats, but is often about kind of structural violence and symbolic violence. I mean, even the idea that you would incorporate it into your thinking ideologies about, well, you know, I wish the police would show up when my jersey gets stolen or whatever it is. I mean, it's like, you don't actually want that, but that's the way that the ideology works. And so one of the things that's really important, I think, coming from all of our work is to refocus. So we're not focused as much on use of force policies and things like this, but instead on how to undo the more deep day-to-day violence of policing. So that's one point. This idea that the solution to policing problems will not be found within policing is a really challenging one. So, and this is why we don't hear a lot about this in conversations on police reform, especially with legal scholars, is people develop expertise in things that they think are the law of police, right? So it's like, well, these are the things that I know about in policing. And it's really strange to write an article or to write a report, and the end of it is like, actually, we see that the system is broken and we should invest our money elsewhere. That's a strange thing for a legal scholar to do in the first place. There are ways that the norms, not just of legal scholarship, but of reform conversation. I mean, I think back to the Ferguson Commission report. The reaction to that is, wait, you're saying that the problem is racial equity. It is not a policing or courts problem on its own. That's a lot for people to take. It makes the agenda seem almost paralyzingly big. And that is part of the story of what we're seeing here. I think I will say, I do think work can be done within policing to make it less harmful and to perhaps lay groundwork for more transformative change. And that is a kind of really granular conversation that I think people who want the horizons that Amna was talking about have to think about. Like, it's like, so what do you do with the cops you have in the status quo? And some of them think they want to be doing something that is approximating closer to justice. What do we do with that? How do we think about that? I don't know the answer, but it's a question I think about a lot. And then the final point I just want to raise, as it relates to the last one, is so I think a lot of the debate between the quote unquote like liberal reformer and the quote unquote like abolitionist radical, which I'll just want to be really forthright and say I don't relate to that. Like I like any of that debate. Like I sort of think we need to have incremental reforms. And I actually think, you know, I mean, I know abolitionists think this too, people who really strongly self-identify. I guess I would say that we have to recognize, if you're going to be involved in within system reform, that what you're building toward is not justice, or that what you would achieve, maybe it's to say it this way, what you would achieve with your reforms is not justice. And I'm actually inspired here to some degree by notions of Afro-pessimism, which might be kind of a lot to raise in a conversation about legal reform. I think there's something about abolition. There's something about an abolitionist vision that is almost like super optimistic. And I don't know if I can be as optimistic. I am somewhat convinced, if we like kind of take it back to the Derek Bell way of thinking and the permanence of racism and the permanence of anti-Blackness, and if you believe that, then that raises real questions about A, what you think the horizon should be, but B, maybe you value certain types of reforms that may or may not take you the full way to your ideal horizon, because at the end of the day, you're like that cynical. I don't know, but just wanted to put it on the table, and I look forward to the further conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that. I will definitely pick up on that in our conversation. But let me turn to you, Jocelyn, first, with your reflections on perhaps what's been said and what you're thinking about the reluctance of many people to even imagine something other than what we have now.
Yeah, I want to pick up on Monica's point about expertise, and especially since we're virtually at a law school right now. I'm picturing us in an auditorium at Penn, and so we're virtually in these halls of expertise about the law and policing. And I just want to underscore how hard that makes it to then think of solutions or part fours to our law review articles that don't work within those frameworks. And one of the things that's, for me, sort of helped me notice that and see that more is, again, looking to social movements and what they're doing, but looking specifically in recent years to proposals for something, quote, for reform, right? So this is what would be what abolitionists on the ground are proposing, because, as Monica said, they don't want to just do nothing. They want to, within their Black and brown communities, within their poor communities, they are frustrated with the everyday violence of policing, and they want something different. And so what they're asking for is not the same technocratic fixes that we're used to seeing in courtrooms or elsewhere. For instance, banning chokeholds, or having implicit bias trainings, or having community policing, in which police officers do a better job at listening to what communities want. All three of those things are things that have been going on in Minnesota for years. In Minneapolis, within Minnesota for years. And yet, of course, we see the knee on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes. And so when you think about these technocratic ideas of we need to measure what is the specific change in policing policy that's going to lead to an outcome of less police violence, or that's going to lead to an outcome of fewer things that we classify as crimes, or that's some kind of cost-benefit description, comparison between those two. To crunch those numbers and figure that out is something that one can engage in, right? It's a complicated analysis to try to figure that out. But social movements aren't asking for that analysis to be done better. They're asking for something else, which is a shift in who gets to decide what policing is in the first place. They're asking for arrangements like community control of the police, which in one iteration, for example, the current ordinance in Chicago being proposed called CPAC, would be neighborhood level elected councils, essentially, that govern policing. And so they would be able to decide, again, really basic things like, are the police going to be in this certain area at all? Will they be armed? Rather than, are we going to have a rule in our police manual that says that you can't have a chokehold? And I mentioned the chokehold one because to me, it makes very good sense that we should have a rule that you shouldn't have a chokehold, right? That's not an absurd reform. That makes good sense. And yet still, it's not the demands that we hear. What we hear instead is we want more power over the governance arrangements in our neighborhoods. Or if you look at the current demands under the 8 for Abolition group or the Movement for Black Lives, they're asking for, they're using words like self-governance and asking for more control over their communities in any number of ways. And so if we think of that as a demand for a shift in power, a shift in who decides what the rules are, a shift in who decides how we're going to respond when we think that someone might have been harmed, who decides how we're going to respond to the problem of homelessness. Going back to Monica's point, that means that us here virtually sitting in a law school are maybe not the ones who can figure that out just on our own. And so that means that we need to cede power too. And it's really hard to cede power. And so I think that's another, obstacle in our way, is that there are so many elites who really want there to be less police violence, who really want a more just world, and who really want some of the structural changes that both Amna and Monica were talking about. But it might be that in order to get there, we have to sort of let go of some of our claims on expertise and in some of our claims of that we know how to get there. Perhaps out of notions about what it means to have a democratic state, or maybe just because that's what people who are most affected by police violence right now are asking us to do, at a moment where these uprisings and these demands, right, to defund the police and invest state resources in other ways are part of the conversations that we're all having. So I can stop there, although again, I want to sort of respond to everything.
Again, yeah, that raises some more really profound questions that maybe we can wrap up this part of the discussion with. So just a couple tensions I see here, or questions that I see coming out of this discussion are the idea that an abolitionist approach envisions a different kind of society. And that is a distinctly different approach from the technocratic approach, Jocelyn, that you just called it. But Monica raises the question, but what do we do in the meantime? Well, she actually raises two questions. One, is that too optimistic to think that we are going to have that kind of a society anytime soon in America? But the second point she makes is, what do we do in the meantime? How do we figure out what are the most effective steps to take, actions to take, demands to make in the meantime? And she raised the question of making policing less harmful. I think abolitionists have engaged in actions that try to make prisons less harmful, like abolishing solitary confinement. I mean, I think that's an abolitionist step, to get rid of solitary confinement. It doesn't abolish prisons altogether. It doesn't create the society we want, but certainly reduces the suffering of people in prisons. And that's important too, or abolishing bail. So freeing people from prison is something good to do. And the idea of non-reformist abolitionist reforms, that we understand that this is an incremental process and there are actions we want to see, or changes we want to see take place, that divest power, resources, tools, ideas from carceral systems, even though they don't completely eliminate them. So that's something to think about too. Then Jocelyn also raises the question of, maybe it's not so much about figuring out the exact, even non-reformist reforms, as who has the power to decide what public safety means in the first place. And, but again, how do we get there? If we're going to really be engaging in working toward the transformation we want and the society we want, how do we do that? And this brings up tensions. I know in our prior discussions, Amna had also raised the question of, who do we work with in order to achieve that? Only people who are self-described abolitionists and have the exact, the same goals? Or what about people who don't call themselves abolitionists? Maybe they're more pessimistic. It's like Monica. No, I don't want to put you in any camp. You don't believe in these camps, Monica, you said. Anyway, but but we have to work, I give the example, and I'll turn it over after this, because what I want to ask you all is, what can you give us some examples that you've seen that are inspiring, effective, that we could use as models, as inspirations for what we should be doing. One example that I take a lot of inspiration from is the Chicago ordinance that addressed torture by John Burge and other police officers in the Chicago Police Department, and got reparations for survivors, their family members, provided for education about police torture and racial justice in the Chicago public school systems, provided for education and other forms of reparation. That was passed by the city council. So the people who were involved in that call it an abolitionist effort, because it did not involve relying on a judge, to issue an order, but it did involve hearings before the Chicago City Council and action by the City Council. So we are talking about steps that will engage the state, will engage people who may not have the same vision. And that's another tension. So I don't know if we can do all this in 10 minutes, but these are some of the questions that you all elicited. I think it would be really helpful for people listening and for each other to think about examples of movement, actions, other kinds of efforts that can provide us some insight into how to grapple with these tensions. So again, if you want to start, but again, if somebody is moved, feel free to jump in.
I feel like it might make sense for someone else to go first, especially because I'm worried I'm going to talk for too long.
Okay, well, I'm thinking that, Jocelyn, we might pick up with where you left off, because you were giving examples from collective community action, and maybe you might tell us in a little bit more detail about a particular one that was effective. I'm interested in learning more about everything you just said, the proposal in Chicago, for example, but whatever you think. We have about 10 minutes left before I think we really do need to turn to questions and answers.
Great. Well, yeah, I can try to be quick. I mentioned proposals for community control of the police. There are similar ones in DC. Actually, a number of places, both small towns and large cities, have these proposals that involve communal, not just oversight, but governance of the police. I think that's exciting. I actually want to mention another one too. So, community control of the police would be a reform within the institution of policing that shifts power relationships directly and deliberately. If we're starting to think more broadly, especially thinking about calls to defund the police right now, something that's inspiring me right now is just some of the action going on in local governments trying to figure out their budgets, and in social movements intervening and coming in and either spending a lot of time through political education and getting together and handing people's budgets. For instance, in Los Angeles, that just happened. There's a people's budget that dozens of movements in coalition with each other came together and gave in. And we're seeing that then city council people or town aldermen, or however the governance is structured, are then taking and saying, oh, it seems like people have gotten together to think, not should we have the police, but if you have $1 billion, how do you want to spend it? And I'm not surprised that the polling on defund the police is low, but if you do the polling of how much money do you think we should be spending on policing, you get a very different answer.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I'm inspired by, and again, I do think it's coming from movement spaces, but I also think we're all doing it together, just as we talk about current events, is noticing where our state is spending its resources and where it's not. And I mean state with a little s. And so what's exciting me right now are people's budgets, are people getting together on Twitter or through polls and trying to figure out where people want to spend their money. And this is actually something that a lot of movement organizations have been doing for a long time, calling for invest, divest strategies, having, one of my favorite examples of this is some people may have heard of the National Night Out Against Crime, which happens, I think, every August, sponsored by police departments. I think there's federal money for it. I've been to a few of them. It's like barbecues with police officers, community policing, etc. Well, the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights in Oakland has had a National Night Out for Safety and Liberation for years, in which they get together and they just ask the question collectively, again with a barbecue, what does safety mean to you? You know, safety is this, safety is that. Again, with the larger theme, in their words, of we keep us safe, but also that we're able to present a different vision of directly of where state resources should go. So that's another thing that I find inspiring right now. And again, I think it doesn't mean that you sit down with your own pie chart and decide how you would want your locality to spend it, but you get together with other people and start having those discussions.
Yeah, that reminds me also of people getting together to form different mutual aid collectives, work that Black anti-carceral feminists have been doing for a long time, how to deal with domestic violence without calling the police. There's a lot that communities can do, and how can we support those community networks and ideas? Maybe some of the money that's going to police could support them in, you know, in various ways. Of course, the technicalities of that have to be worked out, how that's going to work, but those are other ways that communities can be safe without relying on the police. Who wants to go next? Monica, do you want to?
Sure, we'll just do it reverse. I'll jump in here and be really fast. So in terms of proposals I found interesting, so one thing that is interesting to me, I've been doing some research with the Seattle LEAD program, which stands for Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. And one of the things that's super interesting about what they're doing right now is they're kind of radically shifting their relationship to police as gatekeeper for the program. And so like for people like me who kind of have been studying LEAD from afar, it's like, oh, that's a thing, it's just like a police diversion thing, like police are really out front. But I think that actually was never totally true. I've been learning more recently, and I think that they are kind of moving in a much different direction to try to become more of an alternative emergency response, which is just interesting as a kind of technocratic matter about how you create alternative response systems. The other thing I want to mention is that, so when I think about the Amy Cooper story and the Barbecue Becky story, so we have this like deep problem that we're not really talking about, which is that like white private actors are, you know, doing this police calling business. So what do we do with that? One of the things that I'm finding fascinating is the kind of how quickly the police show up or not, which is this thing that, you know, police and 911 dispatchers triage calls, they provide information, and there can be a slower response and a smaller response, and that can be a life-saving type of thing. And so I think one way to kind of just shift the level, I mean, this isn't like a major reform, but this is just kind of like an understanding what we have now. How could you have less of it? One way you can have less of it is by having less response by police to things that seem like they might be racist calls. So anyway, interesting to me.
Yes. Yeah, well, I was just talking with someone the other day about how everybody knows 911. to call the police, and people don't know alternatives. I mean, I think all of you brought that up, that the alternatives aren't available. And so, as Monica, as you were saying, you found that Black mothers rely on the police in so many ways because that's the way the resources are structured in that way, but they could be structured in another way. They don't have, I found in my research on the foster care system that Black mothers rely so much on this very punitive, destructive system for care for their children. They hate it. They hate it. They call it abusive. They call it a form of slavery, but that's what exists in their neighborhood to get help with your children. So very, very similar. Why can't we have other ways of support for people and families? Amna, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I do. And I'll try to be quick, but I will admit that I cheated and I looked at the Q&A and I saw there's like a bunch about what's the difference between like reformist reforms and non-reformist reforms, or what are abolitionist reforms. So I'm going to try to answer this question by like thinking about that with the audience and responding. Okay.
Very good.
So,
very good.
First, like, I think, you know, we've kind of been grappling with and putting on the table abolition as a radical kind of capacious project. And one thing I think is really important for people to think about, engage with, lean into, is it's not one of kind of like one meta project where we could clearly tell you here are all of the commitments, right? Part of the reason why I think it's taken hold in the way that it has is because it reflects anti-racist commitments, anti-capitalist commitments, anti-patriarchal commitments. There are more Afro-pessimist kind of thinking and kind of versions of abolition. There are ones that are more anarchist, some that are more state-oriented, kind of socialist. And so you have like a range of tensions and different ways of thinking about what an abolitionist future would look like. It's not one kind of self-presenting or unified vision necessarily, except for it's about prison abolition is about tearing down prisons and police and thinking about and implementing different modes of collective care and social provision. But beyond that, I think there's a lot of space for difference. And so in terms of non-reformist reforms, like this concept, which I think we're hearing about increasingly and is so important to engage with, it poses this question about whether reform can really usher in any kind of radical transformation. That frame kind of comes out of socialist thinking in the 20th century and then has been used, and continues to be used now by abolitionists and other kind of within other left social projects. And so like the basic framework, which I'm sure many of you know, but since there've been a bunch of questions, is a non-reformist reform as a reform that undermines the logic of the prevailing political, economic, social system, and that gestures at and makes feel closer an fundamentally altered political, economic, social system. The other part that's really key is that in abolitionist, socialist, and kind of all the conceptions of non-reformist reforms I've seen, is that non-reformist reforms expand the space for the democratic exercise of power, right? So whether that be about that the demands come from everyday people taking actions in social movements, uprisings, and strikes, and they expand the space for people to take more demands and make more entitlements going forward. So there you can think about participatory budgeting or voting for all regardless of citizenship and that kind of thing. The other thing that's important, I think, is that abolitionists thinking about what kinds of transformation to fight for are kind of focus you or suggest that you pay deep attention to reform projects as both about ideological and material world building, right? So what are the ideas that kind of support the infrastructure, and then how do we build different infrastructures that facilitate different ideological frameworks of coexistence? And so really practically and concretely, three resources that I think are really, really useful for thinking about how to think about abolitionist steps right now. One is that there's a critical resistance. You can Google and find these very easily. One is the critical resistance chart called Reformist Reforms versus Abolitionist Steps on Policing. Rachel Hertzing wrote an op-ed in Truth Out called Big Bold Dreams for a Police-Free Future that came out a few years ago that also provides a kind of framework. And then finally, Mariam Kaba has this pithy list, police reforms you should always oppose. Those three kind of documents, if you read them side by side, will give you a really kind of robust framework for thinking about the kinds of reforms that are compatible with an abolitionist imaginary. And then in terms of other kinds of campaigns and kind of experiments going on. One, you have a bunch of abolitionist policy platforms now that you can look at and learn from. There's the Vision for Black Lives, there's the Gente Free Our Future, there's Red Nations, the Red Nations Red Deal, which is the first kind of platform I've seen that in its call for abolition also calls for abolition of the child welfare and foster care or family destruction system, as Dorothy called it. In addition to the campaigns that were already named, I would consider within the abolitionist ambit, not just Free Them All and No New Jails or No Cop Academy, but also things like Cancel Rent and Medicare for All, because those kind of speak to the kinds of entitlements we should be demanding. And then finally, I'm thought of this specifically because Dorothy was talking about Black feminist anti-carceral organizing. There is this question about how to respond to interpersonal harm within our relationships to each other. And there's a lot of work, old and new, that we can look to. This volume, Beyond Survival, is a great resource for folks to look at. Oakland Power Projects, which is a project that came out of critical resistance in the Bay, started something a couple years ago called the Anti-Policing Health Workers Cohort, which provides tools within communities to respond to different things without calling 911. And so there's also those kinds of they're not demands or reforms. They're kind of like these prefigurative projects or ways of shifting the way that we relate to each other in order to displace the need to call police.
Wow, that was a lot of information. Thank you, Amna. And also it did answer some of the questions that came from the audience about the meaning of non-reformist reforms and how to tell whether they are or not. And also a little bit about well, first of all, resources, just giving people resources as well. That's helpful. I'm glancing at the questions. There's too many, even with John's great curation of them. So I am just going to pick some I think that maybe we can possibly answer in 15 or 16 minutes. So one question is about body cameras. And I think maybe at least a couple of you mentioned them as an example of a liberal or maybe technocratic reform. And someone in the audience is saying, but couldn't body cameras contribute to the abolitionist project by continuing to expose the violence of policing? So maybe by explaining the criticism of police body cameras, it might also help to distinguish between a reformist reform and a non-reformist reform. So what is it about body cameras that have been, well, I won't say anything because actually if you think about most of, many of the videos that have exposed violence by police, that it hasn't been the body cameras, it's been people, bystanders cameras. But I'll let you, that's one point I'd like to make, but maybe someone would like to jump in and answer.
I can jump in with a couple of thoughts, and then I know that both Monica and Amna have other perspectives to add. And I really actually don't always come back to power as the answer to everything. But to spend a lot of money giving a police department cameras that it controls, using a lens that's from the perspective of the police officer, which also alters how we see a video, is not to shift power in many ways, and perhaps not to shift power at all. Although there is a moment down the road in adjudication when a criminal case happens in which there is some power shift to be able to have a video of what happened. So it's not that it does nothing, but if you look overall, what it does is hand some resources, some money to the state, hand some power to the state, because that now they have a tool of surveillance on their chests at all times through which they can collect information from their point of view. On top of that, though, to have a reform or say a local ordinance or a state law called the police reform bill, and then the thing that you do is give police body cameras and say you've done reform, is another kind of harm. So the harm is not just the body cameras. It's to hold out body cameras as the answer when what they end up doing is reinforcing the power of the police.
Mm-hmm. Do others have quick answers to that? Or I thought that was a great answer. Maybe we could move on to another question. Here's another question that's very similar, pointing to a particular kind of reform and asking whether you would consider it technocratic and liberal, or whether it's something we should support. And that's ending qualified immunity for police officers that make it very difficult to sue them for civil rights violations.
So I guess I'll jump in on this one. It's something I've thought a bit about. So, I mean, any qualified immunity, sure. But let's think about what it actually takes to sue a police officer, one. And let's think about what type of transformation that is. Qualified immunity does things about individual, like it very much comes from a bad apples mentality about the problems of policing. The fundamental idea is you sue, there's a remedy that is individualized, and then maybe there's some sort of deterrence theory. But there's no theory that comes from that that's about changing policing. And it doesn't understand this fundamental point that all of us have raised, which is that actually the harm, if you look at it from the vantage point of communities, the harm that is felt is often the type of thing you're not going to deal with in a lawsuit because it's routine. And so that's the problem. And the political problem goes back to Jocelyn's point about body cameras. It's not that it's bad to end qualified immunity. It's just like, why is that the lawyer's solution here, as opposed to putting something else first? Because we have limited political energy and limited movement capacity. And so what are we going to prioritize? That's my issue with the qualified immunity response, although I retweet articles about qualified immunity being bad all the time because I'm like, yeah, it is bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's effective, I think, to share how the system favors police in really dramatic ways. When you share the cases where police officers have done blatantly violent, illegal, horrific acts of violence, and the judge says, sorry, qualified immunity, because that's just how police act. How would they have known it was illegal to shoot an unarmed person for no reason? And I don't think I'm exaggerating what some judges have said. So it is very effective to point that out. I think it helps people understand how the legal system supports police violence in cases where other people would be incarcerated or suffer. In most of these cases, it's for money damages. But on the other hand, the reverse isn't true, that this is the best way to get the structural change that we're looking for. Shall I ask another question? Unless there's someone wants to. So another question is about something that came up in our discussion, the way in which policing is actually a broader form of oppression and maintenance of an unjust racial order than police departments or police officers. Monica mentioned various ways in which police are sort of gatekeepers for entry into other kinds of systems like housing. I mentioned the entanglement of police with another policing system, which I'm not sure, but may affect more people, at least as many people as police in prisons, and that's the child welfare or foster care or family destruction system, with a third of children in the United States have been subjected to some kind of investigation, child welfare investigation, and half of all Black children are involved during their childhoods in investigation by Child Protective Services. Don't have time to go into why that's disruptive and traumatic for children and families, but this is another example. And so the question is, how can we incorporate better re-envisioning policing or public safety that in a way that extends to these other forms of carceral involvement and punishment and surveillance that go on in America, and also our ways in which the state addresses people's everyday needs and social conflicts. And since there's a bit of a pause, Amna, you're about to, but let me just jump in and just mention something that I wrote recently in Chronicle of Social Change last week, actually, calling on people who are calling to defund the police not to recommend that money be diverted from the police to child protective services. This has been very common, and child protective services is also a punitive, destructive policing agency that has tremendous powers, especially in Black and Indigenous communities. So that's just one way I've intervened recently to say we need to pay attention to these connections. And if we want a society that has a radically different way of addressing the needs of struggling families, we have to also dismantle and completely transform our approach to children's welfare, families' welfare. So that's one way I've been thinking about this. I wonder if you all have some other thoughts about these intersecting forms of policing and how we might approach that.
I'll say something that also responds a little bit to the prior question, which is somewhat about like the slippery nature between reformist and non-reformist reforms, or what are abolitionist demands, is that part of the power of the non-reformist reform, and you can think about defund right now, is that it throws the system, the prevailing order, in crisis, because it poses a challenge that's kind of like hard for the system to metabolize in the way that it functions. So that's part of why, like when people say defund, and a lot of people who live in the land of criminal law reform are finding a hard time metabolizing it. That's part of why, because it's in such a different, it moves such a different critique of the problem and a different kind of road to change, or road of change, that it's hard to process. But even defund, which kind of fits into the classic rubric of an abolitionist demand in that it demands a decrease of power, resources, personnel, et cetera, of police, even that can be co-opted, right? If the movement and the organizing don't continue to sustain themselves, continue to kind of survive the massive state repression we're already seeing and will continue to see. And just think about, for example, like in Los Angeles, where the mayor has said something about cutting the LAPD budget by 150 or to 250 million, which in some ways is a massive amount of their budget. But then he also said that once he cut the 150 million, it would bring the LAPD budget down just to 50% of kind of the city's general expenditures. And so, cities can take on the defund demand and just slightly kind of change up what they're doing. And so then, like, something that becomes a radical non-reformist reform, once it becomes metabolized enough to kind of co-opt or kind of demobilize the demand and kind of the world that it's calling for, then it can quickly shift into something else. And so in terms of posing the question, or more of us focusing on the violence of the family regulation system, or all the other forms of policing that we are familiar with, immigrant policing and so on, is simply to continue to organize, continue to build alternatives, continue to ask questions. And the Angela Davis book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, right? That's kind of the answer, is that on the one hand, I think, there is a danger that we'll kind of focus myopically on policing without understanding all of the kind of structural and systemic forces that keep inequality in play. And yet the answer is just to continue kind of to do the work to organize, build alternative ideological frameworks, experiment in different ways of taking care of each other, make demands that throw the system in crisis, take to the streets to make sure that all of us who are excluded from kind of participating in the formal channels of power are still heard, and so on and so forth.
Woo! Amna, you have a way of saying so much, condensing it into 2 minutes. It's amazing. Okay, all of you are amazing. My head is spinning. And I just thank you so much. I think we might have, I mean, we have 4 minutes left. So, but the problem is this last question is so capacious that I'm not sure if we can do it. But there was a question about whether there are any historical or international precedents for abolition that we could look to. So you gave lots of examples about current organizing, and this audience member wants to know about, can we take hope and inspiration from the past or from global movement building?
I mean, Dorothy, if I may, didn't you just write the foreword to the Harvard Law Review in response to this question?
Well, I didn't mention my article, and actually it does cover a lot of the topics we talked about and has lots of footnotes, so that has many sources. So the latest foreword to the Supreme Court issue published last November, Abolition Constitutionalism, has tons of footnotes, 122 pages, and half of them are footnotes. So that might be helpful. But other ideas? I mean, I can mention, since you brought that up, something that I found extremely helpful in doing research for that article, and that was prison organizing. So organizing by incarcerated people who have voiced abolitionist theories in various ways. And also it grounded me in what people who are incarcerated are asking for, are demanding, are thinking about what would be useful to them. And I found that really important, and also found that there is quite a bit of literature out there written by incarcerated people. And you could look to my article to find citations and sources for those online. You can find incarcerated people's writings. Of course, the letters of George Jackson were really, really helpful to me as well.
Can I just say something really quickly, which is, I think we also need to change our notion of victory. So there's inherent in that question, this idea that if we've seen a big, grand policy change, then we will know that victory has been achieved. And Dorothy, what I was struck by in your response is like, there is local prison organizing that is achieving change of a certain sort that isn't just about policy change, but is also about mind change, ideological change. And look, the horizon, to use what the language that Amna brought to the table, is long. We have to understand that this is not, we're not doing this for our generation right now. Like, there's excitement around defund, and that's great. And I'm like, on board with that as a general project, but we have to learn how to evaluate change and think about change in a generation sense. So I hope that we will do that. I don't know, that's just my kind of final thought for today.
Yeah, I think that's a great final thought. I think as I get more and more seasoned in these struggles, I look more and more to my students, my inspiring students, and other young people who are organizing for hope and inspiration. And I agree, that's a very good point, that this is a long, constant struggle. And I'm just grateful to all three of you for your insights and wisdom and experiences and all the work you do, your writing, and the writing that's forthcoming from all three of you. I can't wait to read it. So thanks so much for this terrific panel. We could keep going. I see John is there now to send us off, but thanks to you and to all the 300 or so participants. Thank you, and take good care.
It's a measure of your star power that we actually had 400 participants. and I'm delighted that they did. It was very hard for me to keep up because I was taking so many notes. The information, the thoughtfulness, and just the depth and breadth of what you guys have presented here is really extraordinary. We at the Quattrone Center, at the Toll Public Interest Center, the Office of Inclusion and Engagement, we're in your debt. And I hope that everybody will come join us in 2 weeks for Structural Frustrations, Challenges to Implementing Change, where we'll bring together 4 experienced urban policy and policing reformers, Everett Gillison, the former deputy mayor for public safety and the chief of staff of the city of Philadelphia, Angelica Hendricks, who's a policy analyst for the Philadelphia Police Advisory Commission, Charles Ramsey, who's a Penn Law Distinguished Policy Fellow and a former chief of the Philadelphia Police Department and co-chair of President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force, and Sozi Talante, a Penn Law lecturer and a former Philadelphia city solicitor, to talk about why some of the reforms that we've talked about, despite good efforts, have been unable to be implemented given the current structures. And I think the depth and breadth of the conversation that the 4 of you have just led us through indicates, how pervasive some of these challenges are. And we look forward to working with you in the future to see some of them realized and really appreciate everything that you've shared with us. So thank you very much. We will send out a link when this is posted on video, but we really can't thank you enough. This has been extraordinary.